I spent 4 hours cooking the perfect Sunday roast to keep the peace. But when my mother-in-law suddenly collapsed, I realized her medical emergency was actually a trap, and I was the only one who saw the strings. The Sunday roast was supposed to be a peace offering, but in the Miller household, peace was a foreign language my mother-in-law, Diane, refused to learn. She sat at the head of the table, her eyes darting between my husband Mark and me, measuring our marital happiness like a hawk tracking a wounded rabbit. I had spent 4 hours in the kitchen, carefully deboning a roast chicken and roasting root vegetables, hoping that a full stomach might stifle her usual criticisms about my career, my clothes, and my alarming lack of interest in her unsolicited advice on child rearing. The air was heavy with the scent of rosemary and tension. Diane reached for the gravy boat, her movements stiff, almost performative. Then, mid-reach, she froze. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she emitted a low, guttural moan that sounded less like a medical crisis and more like a poorly rehearsed scene from a daytime soap opera. The gravy boat tipped, splattering brown liquid across the pristine white tablecloth, and she slumped forward, her forehead landing with a soft thud against the edge of the mahogany table. "Mom!" Mark shrieked, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor as he scrambled to her side. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, his face turning a panicked shade of crimson. "Mom, can you hear me? Someone call 911!" I stood still, my hand gripping the back of my chair. I'd watched Diane pull these stunts before. The fainting spells, when I announced my promotion, the heart palpitations, when we mentioned moving to the city. Every time, she miraculously recovered the second the spotlight shifted back to her, or when she realized we weren't buying into the drama. Her breathing was too rhythmic, her posture just a little too deliberate as she slumped. Mark was sobbing now, shouting her name, his fingers fumbling with his phone. "She's not responding, Sarah. Why are you just standing there? Call an ambulance." I didn't reach for the phone. I leaned in, my gaze fixed on her face. I noticed the faint, almost imperceptible quiver of her left eyelid, a telltale sign that she was waiting for our reaction, waiting for the frantic tears and the desperate pleas. She wanted the validation of our terror. She wanted to be the center of the universe for one more afternoon. "She's fine, Mark," I said, my voice cold and steady, cutting through his hysterics. "She's just doing what she always does when she feels like she's losing control of the conversation." Mark spun around, his eyes wild with betrayal. "How can you say that? She's dying. You're heartless." I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for my phone, but not to call the paramedics. I opened the camera app, zooming in on Diane's hand, which was resting near the edge of the table. In the chaos, she had shifted slightly, and for a split second, I saw her fingers twitch. Not in the rhythmic pulse of a stroke victim, but in a calculated, deliberate tap against the wood, as if she were keeping time with a ticking clock. "You want an ambulance?" I asked, looking directly at the spot where she was unconscious. "Fine. Let's see how much she likes the bill for a false alarm." I dialed the number, my thumb hovering over the screen, watching her closely. I wasn't just calling for an ambulance, I was calling her bluff. But as the operator picked up and asked for my location, Diane's body suddenly went rigid. Her eyes flew open, but they weren't glassy or unfocused. They were sharp, piercing, and filled with a cold, terrifying clarity I had never seen before. She didn't look like a woman recovering from a stroke. She looked like a woman who had just realized her trap had been walked into, or perhaps a woman who had just snapped. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto mine with such intense malice that I felt the breath leave my lungs. Then she let out a sound that froze my blood, a low, clicking chuckle that didn't sound human at all. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice crisp and entirely devoid of the frailty she'd feigned seconds earlier. Now, There's no turning back. The silence that followed her whisper was suffocating. Mark, still hovering over her, froze, his hands trembling on her shoulders. "Mom?" he stammered, his voice cracking. You're okay? You just scared the life out of me." Diane didn't look at him. She didn't blink. Her eyes remained locked on mine, a predatory, unblinking stare that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The stroke had vanished, replaced by a composed, terrifying sharpness. She slowly sat up, smoothing her skirt with an agonizing, deliberate slowness, as if she were a queen settling onto her throne after a peasant had dared to touch her hem. "Mark, dear," she said, her voice smooth as silk but laced with a razor-thin edge, "your wife seems to have a very curious idea of what constitutes an emergency. She enjoys making a spectacle, doesn't she?" My blood ran cold. The phone was still pressed to my ear. The operator was asking, "Ma'am, is there someone in medical distress? We have an ambulance headed to your address." I should have said it was a mistake. I should have told them to cancel. But Diane's eyes warned me against it. She wanted them to come. She was smiling, a thin, cruel line that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. We have a medical emergency. Please, hurry." Mark looked at me, bewildered. "Sarah, what are you doing? She's clearly fine." "I don't think she is," I replied, watching Diane. Diane chuckled again, a dry, rasping sound. She stood up, her balance perfectly restored, and walked toward the kitchen counter. She picked up a sharp paring knife I'd used for the carrots, turning it over in her hand, inspecting the edge. "You know, Sarah," she murmured, her back to us, "people often underestimate the elderly. They think we're fragile. They think we're stagnant. They forget that we've had decades to learn exactly how to break the people who think they're smarter than us." She turned around, the knife held loosely but threateningly. Mark stepped between us, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Mom, put the knife down. You're acting insane." "Insane?" She let out a laugh that sounded like cracking glass. "I'm just beginning, Mark. Your wife wanted an ambulance? Let's make sure she has a reason to be in one." She lunged, not at me, but toward the dining room table. With a violent, unnatural strength, she grabbed the heavy glass centerpiece, a vase I'd received as a wedding gift, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall inches from my head, glass raining down on my shoulders. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing with a jolt of pure terror that this wasn't just a tantrum. The way she moved, the way she calculated the trajectory, the way she was now blocking the doorway to the kitchen. She wasn't playing a game anymore. She was cornering me. "Mark, get out of the way!" I screamed, lunging for the front door, but she was faster than a woman her age had any right to be. She darted in front of me, planting her feet, her expression shifting into one of pure, unadulterated hatred. "No one is leaving until the paramedics arrive," she hissed, her face inches from mine, smelling of stale perfume and something else, something metallic, like iron. "And when they do, you're going to tell them exactly what you did to me." She raised her hand, and before I could dodge, she slammed her own palm against the corner of the table, hard enough to bruise, and then turned it toward me, her eyes wide with a sudden, feigned, pathetic terror. She started screaming, not a sound of pain, but a high-pitched, rehearsed wail, just as the distant, rising wail of the sirens began to pierce the quiet of our suburban street. "She tried to kill me!" she shrieked, tears instantly welling in her eyes, her transformation into a victim so rapid and practiced it made my stomach churn. "She pushed me! She's trying to finish me off!" I backed away, my hands raised, realizing the trap hadn't been the stroke. The trap was the arrival of the police and medics. I looked toward the front window. The red and blue lights were already pulsing against the curtains, casting hellish shadows across the living room. Diane turned to me, her voice dropping to a demonic whisper as the sound of the front door being kicked in echoed through the house. "Checkmate, Sarah." The front door flew open, and the room was suddenly flooded with the harsh, sterile glow of flashlights and the rhythmic, urgent heartbeat of a chaotic rescue scene. Two paramedics in neon-trimmed jackets burst in, followed closely by a police officer who had been flagged down by a neighbor. "Paramedics, stand back, give us space," the lead EMT barked, dropping his heavy medical bag onto the rug. Diane didn't just play the part, she lived it. She collapsed onto the floor with a groan that sounded like a Shakespearean tragedy, clutching her arm and pointing a trembling finger directly at me. She did it," she gasped, her voice thick with fake, labored breath. "The argument, she just snapped. My daughter-in-law, she wanted the house. She pushed me against the furniture." I stood there, paralyzed, watching my life evaporate in real time. Mark looked between his mother, who looked every bit the frail, abused victim, and me, his face a storm of confusion and mounting betrayal. "Sarah, tell them you didn't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, tell them you didn't touch her." "Mark, she's lying," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of the absurdity. "She shattered the vase. She lunged at me." The officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his utility belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the mother-in-law. Now." "I am not moving," I cried, desperate to be heard. "She's faking this. Look at her vitals. Check her. She's been perfectly fine for the last 20 minutes. The lead paramedic, a burly man with no patience for family drama, frowned as he hooked an oxygen mask over Diane's face. "She's hypertensive and her heart rate is elevated. Could be a hypertensive crisis or a stroke mimic caused by physical or emotional distress. Either way, she's in a precarious state." He looked up at me, his eyes cold. "You need to step outside, ma'am. You are interfering with life-saving measures." "I am not leaving this house." I dug my heels in, but the officer was already closing the gap. Diane peeked up through her eyelashes, catching my gaze. Her look of agony vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a triumphant, icy grin that only I could see. She was savoring the destruction of my reputation, the loss of my husband's trust, and the encroaching shadow of a criminal investigation. "Mark!" I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward me. "Look at her! Look at her eyes! She's not hurt. She's waiting for us to be separated so she can finish whatever this is." Mark pulled away, his expression hardening. The seed of doubt, planted by his mother's years of subtle manipulation, had finally bloomed into a full-grown oak. "I don't know who you are right now, Sarah. You were acting so aggressive. You were the one yelling about the bill. Who says that to someone who's dying?" I said that because I knew she was lying. The room seemed to shrink. The officer stepped between us, his gaze fixed on my hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. "Ma'am, you're coming with me. We need to talk about what happened here today. We've had a report of domestic disturbance, and now a victim claiming assault." "I'm not a victim," I shrieked, feeling the walls of the room closing in. "She is the victimizer. Check the security system. We have a doorbell camera. It records everything. Look at the footage." The air in the room went dead silent. The paramedics paused in their work. The officer blinked, looking toward the door. Diane's eyes widened, a sudden spark of genuine panic crossing her face, the first real emotion I had seen from her all day. She began to cough, a violent, rattling sound, clawing at her throat. "The camera," I breathed, realizing the leverage I finally held. "The system is tied to my phone. I'll show you. I'll show you exactly how she threw that vase." I reached into my pocket for my phone, but my hands were shaking so violently that the device slipped through my fingers. It skittered across the floor, sliding perfectly under the heavy, immovable mahogany sideboard that Diane had been leaning against. I dove for it, but the officer grabbed my arm, pinning it behind my back. "Easy, don't move." "My phone," I yelled, struggling against his grip. "It's all there. It proves everything." Suddenly, the house went pitch black. Every light in the hallway, every lamp in the living room died simultaneously. In the darkness, I heard the heavy, metallic clunk of the deadbolt sliding into place on the front door. We were locked in. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard a sound that didn't come from the paramedics, the officer, or my husband. It was the low, rhythmic ticking of a countdown, followed by Diane's voice echoing from the darkness, sounding calm, clear, and perfectly healthy. "The footage is gone, Sarah." And now, you're going to find out what happens when you call for help that doesn't actually exist. The darkness was absolute, save for the frantic, sweeping beams of the officer's flashlight cutting through the gloom. In the sudden blackout, the house felt like a tomb. I could hear Mark's ragged breathing, the heavy boots of the paramedics shifting on the hardwood, and the terrifying, steady click-clack of Diane's heels moving across the floor. She wasn't limping. She wasn't gasping for air. She was walking with the poise of a predator closing in on a kill. "Get the lights back on," the officer shouted, his voice tight with confusion as he fumbled for his radio. "Dispatch, we have a total power failure and a security breach at the residence, requesting backup." There was only static in response. A high-pitched, screeching hum began to emanate from the walls. A signal jammer, I realized with horror. Diane had thought of everything. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Mark, listen to me. She's not sick. She's been planning this." A sharp, metallic ping echoed in the room. I swung my head toward the sound. A flicker of light from the officer's torch caught Diane standing by the breaker box in the hallway, her hands still resting on the metal lever. She wasn't looking at the paramedics. She was looking at me, her face illuminated in the harsh, blue-white glare of the flashlight. She held a small, black remote control in her other hand. "You were always so obsessed with the truth, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with an unnatural, chilling calm. "But truth is a commodity. It's expensive, and tonight, you can't afford it." She pressed a button on the remote. Instantly, the house's internal speakers, usually reserved for calming jazz, erupted with a distorted, screeching audio file. It was a recording of me. My voice crying, "She's fine. She's just doing what she always does. I want her out of this house." The audio was looped, edited, and amplified until it sounded like a frantic, psychotic breakdown. The officer spun around, his flashlight beam pinning me to the wall. "Drop the act, ma'am. Hands where I can see them." "That's a recording!" I screamed, shielding my eyes from the blinding light. "She's framing me!" Mark stepped into the light, his face pale. "Sarah, what is she talking about? Where did she get that audio?" "It's a deep fake, Mark. She's been recording us for months." Diane began to sob, a perfectly modulated, heartbreaking sound. "She's so sick, Mark. I tried to help her. I tried to keep the peace, but she's been planning this for weeks. She even rigged the security system to delete the logs so she could claim I was the one who was aggressive." The officer moved toward me, his handcuffs jingling. I knew if I let him put those cuffs on, I would never get out of this house. I looked at the floor, seeing my phone half hidden under the sideboard. The screen was still glowing faintly, the camera app still open, the record button still active. I didn't think. I kicked the sideboard with every ounce of strength I had. The heavy piece of furniture slid just an inch, enough to reveal the phone. I dove for it, sliding across the floor just as the officer lunged for me. I grabbed the phone, my thumb hitting the upload to cloud button just as he tackled me to the ground. "Get off me!" I yelled, pinning the phone to my chest. "It's uploaded. It's all live. The police department has it. The neighbors have it. Everyone has it." The officer froze, his hand on my shoulder. The screeching audio loop cut out abruptly. Diane's face, which had been a portrait of sorrow, suddenly went slack. Her jaw dropped. "What did you say?" she hissed, her voice losing its artifice. "I'm a software engineer, Diane," I said, gasping for air as I struggled to sit up. "I don't just use apps. I wrote the security patch for our home network. The moment you jammed the signal, it triggered an emergency cloud backup of every sensor, microphone, and camera in this house. The police were notified by the server 5 minutes ago. Your stroke is being streamed to the department's digital evidence unit right now." The silence that filled the house was no longer heavy with tension. It was heavy with the weight of her defeat. The red and blue lights from outside stopped pulsing as the sirens died down, and the house lights flickered back on, exposing Diane standing by the breaker box, looking small, withered, and utterly defeated. She looked at the ceiling, then at her hands, then finally at Mark. Her son wasn't looking at her with pity anymore. He was looking at her with a clarity that was colder than any winter wind. He walked over to her, his movements stiff, and gently took the remote from her limp fingers. "It's over, Mom," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The front door opened. Real officers, the ones who had received my automated distress signal, walked in with their tasers drawn, but they didn't need them. Diane didn't fight. She slumped, truly this time, not from a fake stroke, but from the crushing realization that her world of shadows had been dragged into the light. As they led her out in handcuffs, she didn't look at me. She didn't scream. She just looked at the mahogany table, the spilled gravy finally hardening into a dark, ugly stain. I stood in the center of the mess, clutching my phone, watching the woman who had tried to destroy me disappear into the night. My marriage was in shambles, my house was a crime scene, and my trust was shattered. But as I watched the taillights of the patrol car fade down the driveway, I finally took my first real breath of air in 3 years. I was finally, utterly, alone.